Warns, April 16th, 1945. Nuremberg, Germany, 14:20 hours. The acrid smoke of burning buildings hung heavy in the spring air as American medics from the 45th Infantry Division's Medical Corps set up their field station in the rubble-strewn courtyard of what had once been Nuremberg's proud Hauptkirche. Mortar shells had reduced the ancient Gothic spires to jagged stone fingers, pointing accusingly at the overcast sky. Among the debris and shattered masonry, a small crowd of German civilians had gathered. Hollow-eyed mothers clutching wounded children, elderly men with bloodied bandages wrapped around their heads, teenagers bearing the thousand-yard stare of those who had witnessed too much destruction in their young lives. They stood in fearful silence, expecting the worst from their American conquerors. Their bodies tensed for the brutality they had been conditioned to believe would follow defeat. First Lieutenant Robert McKenzie, a 26-year-old medic from Toledo, Ohio, knelt beside a German boy who could not have been older than 8. The child's left arm hung at an unnatural angle, clearly broken from falling debris during the previous night's artillery barrage. Blood seeped through his torn shirt, and tears carved clean tracks down his dirt-stained cheeks. His mother, a woman in her 30s whose fine clothing now bore the stains of 3 days without adequate shelter, watched with terror-filled eyes as the American soldier approached her son. She expected violence, perhaps even execution. What she witnessed instead would shatter every assumption Nazi propaganda had planted in her mind about American savagery and racial hatred. Lieutenant McKenzie spoke softly to the child in broken German, his voice gentle and reassuring, as he carefully examined the broken arm. Without hesitation, he reached into his medical kit and withdrew a small piece of chocolate, part of his own K-ration, and placed it in the boy's uninjured hand before beginning treatment. The chocolate bar, wrapped in its distinctive brown paper with Hershey's, printed in simple block letters, would become the symbol that defined this moment of profound moral revelation. In the weeks that followed, as American medical units established aid stations throughout the conquered Reich, this simple gesture would be repeated thousands of times, American soldiers sharing their most precious possessions with the children of their defeated enemies, demonstrating a humanity that Nazi ideology had declared impossible in a racially mixed democracy. The sweetness of American chocolate, freely given to German children by the very soldiers they had been taught to fear as monsters, represented something far more significant than battlefield mercy. It embodied the fundamental difference between a society built on human dignity and one constructed on racial hatred, a difference that would ultimately determine not just the nature of German reconstruction, but the moral foundation of the post-war world order. This moment of unexpected compassion in the shattered heart of Hitler's Reich represented the collision of two irreconcilable worldviews that had been locked in mortal combat for nearly 6 years. For German civilians who had endured months of Allied bombing, Soviet advance from the east, and the final collapse of their 1,000-year Reich, the arrival of American forces meant the end of everything they had been taught to believe about German superiority and destiny. Nazi propaganda had spent 12 years conditioning the German people to view Americans as racially inferior beings, contaminated by Jewish influence and incapable of the moral strength necessary to govern a civilized society. They expected their conquerors to exhibit the same brutality that German forces had inflicted across occupied Europe: mass executions, systematic rape, deliberate starvation, and the complete destruction of German culture and identity. The German people had been systematically prepared for this moment of defeat through years of increasingly desperate propaganda that painted the approaching Allies as subhuman avengers bent on revenge. Dr. Joseph Goebbels had warned repeatedly that American occupation would mean the enslavement of the German race, the destruction of German children, and the reduction of the fatherland to a barren wasteland populated only by inferior races. Nazi racial theory had taught that Americans, as a mongrel nation corrupted by African, Jewish, and other non-Aryan bloodlines, lacked the genetic capacity for mercy, honor, or civilized governance. German mothers had been told that American soldiers would murder their children for sport, while German men had been warned that democratic weakness would give way to communist brutality once the thin veneer of American civilization collapsed under the stress of occupation. These fears were not entirely groundless fantasies. but were rooted in the German people's intimate knowledge of how their own forces had behaved in occupied territories throughout Europe. The Wehrmacht and SS had established patterns of conduct that treated enemy civilians as expendable obstacles to German objectives. In Poland, Yugoslavia, Greece, and the Soviet Union, German occupation forces had systematically murdered civilian populations, enslaved millions for forced labor, and pursued policies of deliberate starvation designed to clear living space for German settlers. The German people knew, even if they had not participated directly in these atrocities, that their soldiers had shown no mercy to enemy children, no compassion for wounded civilians, and no respect for the basic human dignity of conquered populations. The reality of American occupation differed so dramatically from these expectations that many German civilians initially refused to believe what they were witnessing. When Lieutenant McKenzie and his fellow medics began treating German wounded before addressing their own injured soldiers, the watching civilians assumed this was a temporary deception designed to extract information or identify resistance fighters. When American doctors operated on German children using the same techniques and medicines they applied to American casualties, German parents suspected this was an elaborate psychological warfare campaign that would end once intelligence objectives had been achieved. Only when this pattern of humane treatment continued day after day, week after week, did German civilians begin to accept that American mercy was genuine rather than strategic. The chocolate that Lieutenant McKenzie shared with wounded German children became the tangible symbol of this moral revolution that was transforming occupied Germany from a nation of enemies into a society of potential allies. American soldiers carried these chocolate bars as part of their standard K rations, each piece representing the industrial abundance that had enabled the United States to feed, equip, and transport millions of troops across 2 oceans, while simultaneously maintaining civilian living standards at home. The casual generosity with which American GIs distributed these precious commodities to enemy children demonstrated a level of material prosperity that challenged every assumption Nazi propaganda had promoted about American economic weakness and social decay. The symbolic power of chocolate was magnified by its scarcity in wartime Germany, where civilians had been reduced to subsistence rations that barely provided enough calories to sustain life. By 1945, the average German civilian received less than 1,200 calories per day through official rationing systems, while black market prices had made luxury items like chocolate completely inaccessible to ordinary families. Children who had not tasted real chocolate for months or years were receiving it freely from the hands of enemy soldiers, who possessed such abundance that they could afford to share their personal rations with strangers. This material generosity suggested an economic system capable of producing consumer goods in quantities that exceeded immediate military necessities, a level of industrial capacity that called into question everything German civilians had been taught about American weakness and democratic inefficiency. The psychological impact of receiving chocolate from American soldiers was profound and lasting for German children who had been conditioned to fear and hate their conquerors. 8-year-old Klaus Brenner, whose broken arm had been treated by Lieutenant McKenzie in the Nuremberg church courtyard, later recalled in interviews conducted during the 1970s that the taste of American chocolate was his first indication that everything he had been taught about the war might be false. "The soldier who gave me candy was not the monster from the propaganda films," he remembered. "He was kind, gentle, and he fixed my arm so that it would heal properly. If Americans were truly evil, why would they waste their good medicine on German children? Why would they share their food with people who had been trying to kill them?" This process of ideological transformation was documented in countless similar encounters throughout occupied Germany during the spring and summer of 1945. American medical units established treatment stations in bombed-out churches, school buildings, and public squares, where German civilians could receive medical care that often exceeded the quality of treatment available to German soldiers in their own military hospitals. U.S. Army medical records from this period document the treatment of over 180,000 German civilians by American medical personnel between April and August 1945, with mortality rates among German patients actually lower than those recorded for American casualties due to the immediate availability of medical care, without the delays caused by battlefield evacuation procedures. The abundance of medical supplies available to American forces provided another powerful symbol of democratic prosperity that challenged Nazi assumptions about American industrial capacity. German civilians observed American medics using disposable syringes, sterile bandages, and pharmaceutical products with apparent disregard for cost or conservation. Morphine was administered freely to control pain, with dosages calculated according to medical need, rather than supply limitations. Sulfa powder and the revolutionary new antibiotic penicillin were used liberally to prevent infection, with no apparent concern about rationing or scarcity. Blood plasma was available in quantities that seemed unlimited, suggesting medical logistics systems that could maintain fresh supplies even in combat zones thousands of miles from American production centers. The contrast with German medical capabilities was stark and demoralizing for German healthcare professionals, who witnessed American treatment methods. By 1945, German military hospitals had been reduced to reusing bandages, performing surgery without adequate anesthesia, and treating infections with ersatz medications that often proved ineffective. The shortage of basic medical supplies had forced German doctors to make life-and-death decisions based on resource availability rather than patient need. While American medics appeared to have unlimited access to the most advanced medical technologies and pharmaceuticals available anywhere in the world, this material abundance extended beyond medical supplies to include the chocolate, cigarettes, and other personal items that American soldiers shared with German civilians as gestures of human kindness. Each chocolate bar represented not just individual generosity, but the collective prosperity of a society that could afford to equip its soldiers with luxury items while simultaneously fighting a global war on multiple continents. German civilians calculated that the chocolate freely distributed by a single American squad would have cost more on the German black market than most families could earn in a month of wartime labor. This casual abundance suggested economic productivity that exceeded anything the German war economy had achieved, even during its peak years of territorial expansion and slave labor exploitation. The transformation of German attitudes toward Americans and American values was gradual but profound, beginning with the recognition that American actions consistently contradicted Nazi propaganda claims about democratic brutality and racial hatred. Greta Hoffmann, a nurse at a Munich hospital that was converted to treat German civilians after American occupation, later testified that her worldview began to change when she observed American medics working alongside German medical staff, without the racial hostility that Nazi theory predicted would characterize such interactions. The American doctors treated our German patients with the same care they showed to their own wounded soldiers, she recalled in post-war interviews. They shared their medical knowledge freely, taught us new surgical techniques, and provided medicines that we had not seen for years. How could a racially inferior people possess such advanced medical science and such generous hearts? The chocolate that American soldiers shared with German children became a daily reminder of this ideological contradiction that forced German civilians to question everything they had believed about race, democracy, and human nature. Children who received these gifts began asking their parents why American soldiers were kind rather than cruel, why American medicine was superior to German healthcare, and why American abundance exceeded German scarcity, despite years of Nazi propaganda claiming the opposite. These innocent questions from children who had experienced American kindness firsthand proved more effective than any formal denazification program in challenging the racial and ideological foundations of Nazi belief systems. The broader implications of American humanitarian treatment extended far beyond individual acts of kindness to represent a systematic approach to occupation that prioritized human dignity over revenge, reconstruction over destruction, and moral authority over military dominance. While Soviet forces advancing from the east were engaging in systematic rape, murder, and pillage that confirmed German fears about communist brutality, American forces were demonstrating that democratic societies could maintain their humanitarian principles, even when dealing with former enemies who had committed unspeakable atrocities. The contrast between American mercy and Soviet vengeance provided powerful evidence of the moral superiority that would become central to Cold War competition for German loyalty and European reconstruction. The chocolate distributed by American medics also represented the technological and industrial superiority that had enabled democratic societies to outproduce and outfight the Axis powers despite initial disadvantages in military preparation and strategic position. German civilians began to understand that American abundance was not accidental, but was the product of economic and social systems that encouraged innovation, rewarded productivity, and maintained civilian living standards even during total war. The Hershey Company alone had produced over 3 billion chocolate bars for American forces during the war years, a level of industrial coordination and logistical efficiency that impressed German observers who had witnessed the gradual collapse of their own supply systems. The symbolic power of chocolate was reinforced by its association with childhood innocence and maternal care in both American and German cultures. German mothers who watched American soldiers share candy with their children were forced to confront the possibility that their enemies possessed the same protective instincts toward children that they felt toward their own families. This recognition of shared humanity across national and racial boundaries challenged the fundamental premises of Nazi ideology, which had taught that such emotional connections were impossible between superior and inferior races. The sight of American medics treating German children with the same gentle care they would show to their own sons and daughters suggested moral qualities that Nazi racial theory claimed were genetically impossible in racially mixed societies. The medical treatment provided by American forces also demonstrated institutional competence and organizational efficiency that exceeded German military standards despite operating in occupied territory thousands of miles from home bases. German civilians observed American medical units establishing treatment facilities, maintaining supply lines, and coordinating patient care with systematic precision that many found superior to their own experiences with German military medicine. Administrative procedures were transparent and predictable. Medical records were maintained accurately, and treatment protocols were applied consistently, regardless of the patient's nationality or political background. This institutional performance suggested educational systems and cultural values that produced highly skilled, professionally competent individuals capable of maintaining complex organizations under adverse conditions. The transformation of German civilian attitudes was documented in intelligence reports prepared by American psychological warfare specialists who interviewed German populations throughout 1945 and 1946. These reports noted consistent patterns of attitude change among civilians who had received medical treatment from American forces or who had witnessed American humanitarian aid being provided to German children. Initial fear and hostility gradually gave way to curiosity about American society, admiration for American efficiency, and appreciation for American generosity. Many German civilians began expressing hope that American occupation would continue indefinitely rather than being replaced by Soviet control, or a return to German independence under conditions that might restore the chaos and destruction of the Nazi period. The cultural exchange that occurred in American medical facilities provided opportunities for German and American personnel to recognize their common humanity despite the ideological chasm that had divided their nations during 6 years of total war. German nurses worked alongside American medics, sharing professional knowledge and learning new techniques that would benefit German patients long after the occupation ended. American soldiers shared photographs of their families, discussed their hopes for peace, and expressed genuine concern for the welfare of German civilians who had suffered under Nazi rule. These personal interactions demonstrated that Americans possessed the same fundamental human emotions: love for family, compassion for suffering, hope for the future, that Germans recognized in themselves. The chocolate that American soldiers shared with German children also represented the democratic values that had motivated American participation in the war against fascism. Unlike the Nazi concept of racial struggle for living space, American war aims had consistently emphasized the restoration of human dignity, the protection of individual rights, and the establishment of international systems that would prevent future aggression. The generous treatment of German civilians demonstrated that these idealistic war aims were genuine rather than propagandistic, and that American society possessed the moral strength necessary to extend its principles even to former enemies who had committed terrible crimes against humanity. The daily distribution of chocolate and other gifts created lasting memories for German children who would grow up to become leaders of the Federal Republic of Germany during the Cold War decades. These childhood experiences of American kindness and generosity provided emotional foundations for the Atlantic Alliance that would unite Germany with the Western democracies against Soviet expansion. Former German children who had received chocolate from American GIs became powerful advocates for democratic values, NATO membership, and close cooperation with the United States in building the post-war European order. The symbolic significance of chocolate was also recognized by American military leaders, who understood that humanitarian treatment of German civilians was essential for achieving long-term strategic objectives in occupied Europe. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, had issued explicit orders requiring American forces to provide medical care and humanitarian assistance to German civilians, while maintaining discipline and preventing fraternization that might compromise military objectives. These policies reflected understanding that the battle for German loyalty would be won through demonstration of American values, rather than through coercion or punishment. The abundance represented by freely distributed chocolate also challenged German assumptions about American economic sustainability and long-term staying power in European affairs. Nazi propaganda had consistently predicted that American participation in European conflicts would be temporary because democratic societies lacked the will to sustain overseas commitments that did not provide immediate economic benefits. The casual generosity with which American soldiers shared personal possessions suggested an economy capable of supporting indefinite overseas deployment while maintaining high living standards for military personnel. This economic strength implied political commitment to European reconstruction that would continue long after military objectives had been achieved. The medical care provided to German children by American forces also demonstrated technological superiority that had enabled democratic societies to develop more effective treatments for disease and injury than had been available under Nazi rule. German parents observed American medics using medical equipment, pharmaceutical products, and surgical techniques that exceeded anything available in German hospitals even before the war began. The systematic application of scientific methods to medical problems suggested educational systems that encouraged innovation and research, rather than ideological conformity and racial theory. The transformation of German attitudes toward democracy and human rights that began with these encounters between American medics and German civilians would continue throughout the occupation period and beyond into the Cold War decades. The generation of German children who received chocolate from American soldiers would grow up to build democratic institutions, support human rights, and maintain alliance relationships with the United States that would prove crucial for European security and prosperity. The simple act of sharing candy with enemy children had planted seeds of democratic values that would flourish in the soil of post-war German society. By the summer of 1945, American military government reports documented widespread German civilian appreciation for American humanitarian policies and growing support for democratic reconstruction, rather than renewed German militarism or communist revolution. Public opinion surveys conducted by American psychological warfare specialists found that German civilians who had received medical treatment from American forces expressed significantly higher levels of trust in American intentions and support for democratic values than those who had not experienced direct contact with American personnel. The chocolate shared by American medics had become a symbol of American moral authority that influenced German political development for generations. The legacy of this wartime experience extended far beyond immediate post-war reconstruction to influence broader international discussions about human rights, humanitarian law, and the obligations of occupying powers toward civilian populations. The Geneva Conventions, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and other international legal frameworks that emerged after 1945 reflected many of the principles that American forces had demonstrated through their treatment of German civilians during the final months of World War II. The chocolate distributed to German children had represented values that would become foundational elements of the post-war international order. The economic abundance that enabled American soldiers to share chocolate with enemy children also foreshadowed the Marshall Plan and other reconstruction programs that would rebuild European economies according to democratic principles, rather than extracting reparations through punitive policies. German civilians who had witnessed American generosity toward their children began to understand that American occupation offered possibilities for economic recovery and political rehabilitation, rather than permanent subjugation and exploitation. The sweetness of American chocolate promised a future in which former enemies could become allies and partners in building a more prosperous and peaceful world. In the end, the profound impact of chocolate shared between American medics and German children represented something far more significant than battlefield mercy or occupational policy. It demonstrated that democratic societies possess the moral strength, economic abundance, and cultural confidence necessary to transform enemies into allies through consistent application of humanitarian principles under the most challenging circumstances. The chocolate that melted on the tongues of German children in the spring of 1945 carried the taste of freedom, democracy, and human dignity that would reshape European civilization for generations to come. In a continent torn apart by racial hatred and totalitarian brutality, these small acts of kindness pointed toward a future where democratic values could prevail not through conquest alone, but through the irresistible appeal of societies that treated even the children of their enemies as precious human beings deserving of care, protection, and hope for a better tomorrow.